I'm very happy to introduce you to my co-director for the conference today. Joe Herrera is a psychiatry resident and is a minority fellow this year, and it's great that he's sharing his grant with us to make this conference possible today. And this conference is also being supported by the Inclusion Department this year. Before I introduce our first speakers, which I'm considering the host for the day, just briefly I want to talk a little about our patron, Dr. Randy Hillard. Unfortunately, he could not be here today, but he sent me a beautiful letter stating, "Really and truly, I believe that this conference reflects MSU at its best, addressing real-world issues that many other universities ignore, and teaching residents and students like you and Hamada who are able to chart new paths into the future. I also believe that the conference reflects the U.S. at its best, genuinely welcoming diversity, providing opportunity, and allowing each individual to contribute to making the world a better place. And believe me, that is the goal of this conference, to make the world a better place, to give peace a chance." Without any ado, I will start the conference now. I would first like to introduce Paulette Granberry Russell. Dr. Paulette has been employed with Michigan State University since 1998 as the Senior Advisor to the President for Diversity and Director of Office for Inclusion and Intercultural Initiatives. She personifies all my endeavors, so Paulette, Dr. Granberry.
Good morning. Yes, I am particularly pleased to be here this morning, both in terms of offering a broad welcome to all of you today from Michigan State University, but particularly from the Office of the President, Luana K. Simon, and the Office of the Provost, Kim Wilcox, both of whom are very supportive of the conference, but also what the goals are of this conference, which is, and I particularly like the theme and the word accept. And I do want to spend just a couple of moments talking about this, because the work that I do at Michigan State University is to allow us to reach that goal of being an inclusive campus community. And there are days when we are challenged by the goals that we set for ourselves. Certainly when we look around the room, or when we look around the communities that we live in, we acknowledge that we are diverse. But oftentimes we're challenged with this notion of being inclusive. And for us at Michigan State, when we talk about inclusive, it's an acknowledgement of all the differences that are here. But the question is, of all of those who are here, do they actually feel they are a part of this community? That their presence, that their values, that their beliefs are part of the fabric of the institution? Is it okay for me to be at the table, even though I bring with me a set of values, cultural beliefs that are different from the others that are at the table? Are those differences received? Are those differences acknowledged? And to the extent that they can they be embraced? But certainly what we want, I think, as a community of people is to be accepted. And oftentimes in the work that I do, I have to consider the words that we use, because obviously words have impact. And I think certainly one of the goals of today is to look at the impact not only of words but of deeds on the Muslim community. And I think certainly since September 11, 2001, which was a horrific event that had an impact on this country, but particularly on the Muslim community, it's more appropriate for us to give particular attention to the impact of words, certainly of conduct, certainly of words. So when we talk about accept, and I look at the theme, learning the art of coexistence and resilience in conflicting times, I'm one of those people who's trained as a lawyer. And often it's our words that I pay particular attention to. So I choose to look up from time to time words. And Dr. Abbasi asked that we move beyond tolerance to acceptance and to accept. And when you look up the definition of accept, and I choose to look up accept, I looked up the word tolerance, I looked up the word endure. Because when we talk about accept, it means to receive, especially with gladness. Okay, so this notion of being accepted with gladness, especially with gladness, is the sort of thing that resonates with me. But it also says to endure patiently. Okay, so I said, all right, well, what do we mean by endure? And I'll get to that one in just a minute. When I look up the word tolerance, because I think in the work that I do for the last 10 years or so, the use of tolerance is one that's often associated with differences. So can we be tolerant of differences? Can we tolerate differences? And so to mean, well, what we mean by tolerance, to put up with, to endure, to put up with. So do I want to be tolerated? Meaning, do I want you to just merely put up with me? I feel on some days that's how I'm treated, but on most days that's not how I prefer to be treated, not to be put up with, or to endure. And when you look up the definition for the word endure, it means to suffer patiently without yielding. So do I simply want to be endured? So when we talk about tolerance, and oftentimes it's used in the context of diversity, remember how it's defined. And as a part of your existence, do you want to be simply endured patiently? And so I thought about, rather than to be tolerated, to be endured, I prefer acceptance, but there's one that I prefer, and it's just simply to be. And so I said, okay, Paulette, you say you want to be allowed to just be. What does that mean? To exist in actuality, to equal in identity. Now, in the particular dictionary that I was looking this up in, it said after that, to equal in identity, to be Christian was to be Roman. To be Muslim is to be American. They were quoting James Bryce. So, I thought to be equal in identity, I kind of like that even better. When our existence is challenged, when we are feared, when we are ridiculed on a daily basis, it affects us as individuals, but it can create a mindset that what we do on a daily basis, what we believe in, what we don't regard ourselves to be, can oftentimes be perceived by others as a truism. So when we talk about Islamophobia, when we identify, or when we find ourselves being identified with those who might otherwise be regarded as terrorists, is that true? Is that a truism? What impact does that have on us each day in our lives? We're not able to just be. And so oftentimes we are left to cope or wonder why. And what is it about me or my community that can't be endured? I think this conference is timely. I think this conference is needed. And I think about an experience I had just recently last week when I was talking to a group of students in a class. And it was a management class on diversity, and a particular topic had to do with sexual harassment, which is one of the areas that I unfortunately have to deal with from time to time. But afterwards, a student came up and talked to me, and he was describing his experience after being on spring break. And as he was talking about how he had been detained. And he went on to describe his treatment when he was being detained by, in this case, TSA. And we talked about this. Here he is on spring break, on his way to Mexico with his other students, friends. And he was stopped. He was hauled into a private room. And the way that he was talked to for him was obviously very insulting, but very injurious. And as we talked more, I finally said to the young man, because I didn't want to make any assumptions, how do you identify? And where are you from? Because what was said to him was, you shouldn't be worried about your friends. You should be worried about yourself. And when he asked why, he said, he was told, it's because of where you come from. And I said, so tell me where it is that you come from. And he was from Saudi Arabia. And as we were talking, not only was he interested about under what laws can this happen, and we talked a little bit about homeland security, and we talked about the heightened sense of fear, some of it reasonable, some of it unreasonable, and the treatment that comes as a result of all of that. But I listened to his words about the impact that that had on him. Now, he's young, he's smart, and undoubtedly he's resilient. But the question that I was left with was why? Why couldn't he just be? And so I hope as you spend this day with the panel of experts that you have presenting today, that you have opportunities to reflect. I know that for those of you sitting here today that this is probably the choir, but I understand as a person who does this work that sometimes the choir needs to be sustained and fed. And so I just want to extend to all of you my deep appreciation for your work, your interest, your commitment in assuring that not only are we endured, tolerated, accepted, but allowed to just be. Thank you on behalf of Michigan State University for being here today.
As the history tells us, segregation, isolation can be a good politics, but not a good policy. So,
thank you all for coming today. Welcome again to the what I'm proud to announce is the 3rd annual Muscle Mental Health Conference, and hopefully there'll be a 4th and a 5th, and maybe many more for years to come after that. Before I get to our next speaker for the introduction to today's conference, I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge, and I know we typically save acknowledgments till the end, but I wanted to acknowledge some of the significant players in making this conference a reality. First of all, is Dr. Abbasi. I'm standing in a position right now that's probably very similar to where she was about two to 3 years ago. Very inexperienced, but with a very steep learning curve on how to put something like this together. I want to really say that this, the previous two, and in particular this conference, wouldn't have been possible without her very hard work. A lot of times we think of passion as something that somebody just displays, but I think Dr. Abbasi really puts passion into action for something that she really believes in. And this conference is really a great demonstration of that. I also wanted to acknowledge the American Psychiatric Association Minority Fellowship. I'm actually the second minority fellow, Dr. Abbasi being the first through the American Psychiatric Association. And I also wanted to acknowledge their help in putting this conference together. It wouldn't have been possible without them. And I wanted to make a special note that this, in my experience going to some of the annual conferences, when I talked about this conference being one of the components of using the fellowship funds, one of the things that we were putting the funds towards, I was met with a lot of remarks of how unique this really is. And I think that that's hopefully something that the university at large and our university community at large will acknowledge, that nothing like this is really being done throughout the nation. And I think it's something that hopefully, as we generate momentum, that it'll be something that we're able to preserve for many years to come, even far after the hopefully we can get somebody to keep being awarded the fellowship, but beyond that, hopefully this is something that we can sustain. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. I know this gentleman pretty well. He's the chair for the Department of Psychiatry at the college, both College of Human Medicine as well as Osteopathic Medicine. Dr. Jed Megan will give us another brief introduction.
Let me just mention that this is, as far as we know, the only such muscle mental health conference in the country. I think that counts for something. That's would not have happened without her energy. Let me just talk a little bit for a minute about why it is that people are always suspicious. I mean, there are multiple explanations for this, but why is it that we always have somebody in this country, in other countries, about whom we're suspicious? Let's recall that in the U.S., it's always somebody. So over a long history, it was the Irish, no dogs and Irish, that sort of thing. It was the Catholics individually or as a group. If you're old enough to remember, in 1960, there was deep suspicion that Kennedy was going to be controlled by the Pope. In World War I, it was the Germans. In World War II, it was the Japanese. Blacks for a long time, and on and on and on. And the current favorite suspects, of course, are Muslims and Barack Obama. Now, of course, there are multiple explanations for this kind of thing. And the explanations interact. But what I want to try to do is talk about what you might call a more proximate explanation. A more proximate means something closer to, well, why does this behavior actually happen? And this will be somewhat familiar, at least to the psychiatrists in the audience. So to do this, we have to draw from both neuroscience and from evolution. Well, let's start with neuroscience a little bit. And let's talk about the amygdala, which is a nucleus up in your brain. It's very important, and we can see these things on magnetic resonance imaging, and we can actually see people think, essentially. Neurons do more work when they're active, and we can see the amygdala and what it does. And it turns out that if you put somebody in an MRI and present them with a series of faces, the amygdala lights up, among other areas. Fusiform gyrus, a series of areas light up. The amygdala has something to do with fear, other kinds of emotions, both positive and negative. So, put somebody in an MRI, you show them faces of people of their own ethnicity, the amygdala lights up. If you show them faces of individuals of other ethnicities, the amygdala lights up even more. It's even more active, implying that these kinds of emotions, fear, suspicion, negative emotions, and so on, are probably heightened. This tells us that there's these kinds of things, maybe increased alertness, when you view people who you define as not like yourself or as others. Now that's pretty interesting. Why should this be? So we sort of have, that's a partial explanation. Well, it happens because the amygdala lights up. Well, why is that? Why should we be constructed that way? For this, you really have to draw on human evolution. Now, where did we grow up as a species? We really grew up in small hunter-gatherer groups on the African savanna. Of course, we are still, evolution works still, we are still adapted to be hunter-gatherers. In a small hunter-gatherer group, what's important? What's really important is where do you get food that day? Where are you going to sleep that night? How are you going to stay away from predators? Anybody who was outside that small group, another primate, another human, was probably dangerous. So it conferred some adaptive advantage to be very cautious about outsiders coming into the group. Others were dangerous and were still wired to think that. If, in fact, we are wired to do that, then think about this. So someone of another ethnicity moves into your neighborhood and you wonder, why is that person there? You see someone on television who's of another ethnicity. You see a politician who's of another ethnicity. You encounter somebody on the street and you wonder, you begin to have great suspicions and real anxieties about that. Now let me tell you that I spent some time in Africa. And the first time I went to Africa, I was surrounded by black people. I was the only white face on that street. And let me tell you, I was a little anxious about that because my experience is not necessarily in that kind of setting. And just because this was different for me, I was a little anxious about that. And it took me a trip or two or three to be in that environment, to really lose all that anxiety. Now, it's no big deal. And in fact, what that tells you is that the function of experience is very important in these kinds of settings. And in fact, if you do this in an MRI, if you put me in an MRI and did this kind of experiment, the same thing would happen. Over time, if you present people with faces of other ethnicities, the amygdala downregulates. It becomes much less active, and eventually that activity is essentially the same as if you present faces of the same ethnicity to people. So, we do have these hardwired kind of responses. In another context, we're also probably hardwired to react to negative emotions, things that we feel negative and happenings much more quickly and with much more vigor than the positive ones. And in fact, there's good experimental evidence that we remember negative events more clearly than we remember positive events. The eminently practical reason for this is that bad things that happen are much more likely to kill you than good things. And so it was adaptive to remember those kinds of bad things. Put another way, Chris Anderson, who's the editor of Wired magazine, said, the news that an invader has just set fire to your hut demands immediate response. The genes for equanimity in this situation burned up long ago, and that's probably quite true. Sounds pretty grim, doesn't it? We're hardwired to view other people with suspicion, as potentially agonistic, and so on and so on. Is the state of affairs unchangeable? Well, the answer is probably not, almost certainly not, and there is room for optimism. For example, in hunter-gatherer societies and in other primate groups, we look at other primates like a variety of monkeys and so on, depending on the primate, males or females tend to leave the group and go to other groups. And after a long period of, cautious kind of negotiation and so on, they are in fact accepted to the other groups. So primates can accept people they define as others and integrate them into the group. So that's a good thing. Secondly, biology is not determinism. As I said before, in an experimental situation, the amygdala does habituate to these kinds of things. So this is not entirely deterministic. So humans are in fact capable of change and effect. If that weren't true, I would have no profession, right? So that's the more sort of proximate, perhaps more neurobiological, sociological explanation. But let me mention one more thing that's a little less proximate, but also I think is really important. We're getting a lot of census data out the last week or so. And as we understand now, we're becoming a country of minorities. Caucasians will no longer be a majority in this country by 2050. And if you're in a privileged position as a majority, you begin to lose that, it becomes a little anxious. It makes you a little upset. And it kicks in, I think, all those hardwired kinds of tendencies. And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the motivations for the kind of stridency you see. And that's not, as we would like to say in psychiatry, that's not entirely conscious as a motivation. So, to sum up, we as humans, individually and as groups, are capable of profound change. Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck once said, there is a providence that protects idiots, drunkards, children, and the United States of America. And Churchill said you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And that may apply to Libya, actually, today. So a couple of things help. One, it helps to be lucky, and we've been lucky over a long time period in this country. And it helps to have the right impulses. And in large measure, despite the variety of individuals, we have the right impulses. In my personal view, I think, is that, this is a country that's always had a real genius for taking in immigrants, of course. None of us really came from here. We all came from somewhere else at some point. And it really allows immigrant populations really to make the best or worst of their lives. And I think, over time, even though we go through these kinds of things over a long period of time, minorities will become the norm in this country. And in fact, we'll be able to integrate most of what goes on really fairly well. But it's going to take some time. It's not there.
Thank you, Dr. Megan. So, first up this morning, in this series of talks is Daniel Tutt. And I wanted to take a few minutes to a little bit about this individual. First of all, welcome to our third annual conference. Quite a long list of